Well, I'm really happy today, and I think it's the first time we've actually spoken on a podcast or in an interview. So I'm really happy to be here with Laith Marouf, who's back in Beirut, Lebanon. Laith, apart from being a longtime colleague and friend, is a consultant for broadcasting law and policy, specifically the rights of indigenous nations, racialized communities, or those living with disability and protected groups. Laith, hi.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be actually having a conversation with you. We haven't, as you said, had this before.
No, it'll be a first and hopefully not a last. Laith, can you give me and the audience just a little bit of background to your work and your long-term involvement in the resistance movement?
Well, I started doing activism on international issues in the early 2000s, during the beginning of the Second Intifada. I was involved in student organizing for Palestinian rights in a group called Solidarity for Palestinian Rights in Canada. And I was involved in the student unions in general in Canada in the beginning of the 2000s. Part of that activities, the work that I did was the shutdown of Benjamin Netanyahu's speaking engagement in Concordia University in 2002, September 9th, 2002. That's the only time a prime minister of apartheid Israel was not able to spew their hate in any public space in the West. So that set me up both that and the work that I did during 2000, 2001 made me a big target of the Zionist lobby in Canada and the intelligence authorities in general, the Canadian intelligence, American intelligence, Israeli intelligence. At one point, I would say in 2001, it was, very close to being probably rounded up and taken to Guantanamo because of those days. There was I got expelled from Concordia University 3 times, summarily, with no hearings, and 3 times went to court and 3 times won it. With that, I'm basically, I think I hold the world record for a student being expelled from the same institution, higher education institution. So it's funny now. I look back at it. Those were really scary days, if I would say. There was intelligence and RCMP, the federal police, parked outside my home and my office, my work at those times, harassing my parents, death threats and such. I received at my family's work and so on. But if you look back at it, you laugh because on the one hand you realize that apartheid Israel and its backers, imperialist backers, they cannot actually they can't stand any opposition to them. And their propaganda, their mythology of apartheid Israel, all of it is undefensible. So if there's even just a few students that are doing work on one campus anywhere in the West, it immediately leads to the collapse of their power or myth and propaganda, and therefore they have to come down really hard, bring in all the structures of power in the West to bear down on 19-year-old students in a university and bully them into silence. So that's part of how I started, my activism. That prompted me to start working in media development. Although people see me and hear me a lot on media outlets, really, this is not my main interest, and I never had the intention of becoming a media personality. My work has always concentrated on building media capacities. For instance, I launched Under the Olive Tree, was the only Palestinian Canadian show on radio in Canada. It's airing on multiple stations still to today. I launched the international Radio Free Palestine marathon of radio that airs on the Nakba Day in May, bringing in together tens of radio stations across Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and South America to broadcast for 24 hours content on Palestine in Arabic, English, French, and Spanish. And eventually I was involved in television production, and I was the executive director at a TV station called CUTV in Montreal. And it's innovative work that we created of live broadcasting, mobile, with full journalistic packaging from the streets of Quebec during the strike, the student strike of 2012. That broadcast led to the collapse of the government of Quebec and its resignation. And so, I just wanted to kind of briefly tell you, on the one hand, I started working on Palestine in my youth, and that led me to media production. And currently, I am working in media policy and law, concentrating on helping Indigenous and racialized and disability communities, what we call protected groups, to license television and radio stations and receive fully their rights protected under the law to access, reflection, and employment in the broadcasting sectors, and consult on the policies that are written by governments. I work not only in Canada on these issues, in Mexico, in Brazil, in South America. So it's mainly consulting those groups that are seeking these rights and trying to push those rights to be achieved within the media broadcasting regulators in those countries.
All right. Okay. And yeah, I saw you covering recently the discovery of graves of the Indigenous people in Canada itself, which is, another shocking indictment on a settler state's genocidal history, just as it is, of course, in the United States and in Australia and in Palestine. Of course, the pattern of being founded on genocide and ethnic cleansing of all of these imperialist states is a dramatic one when one brings them all together, very much as you do on a regular basis on Twitter. And that brings me to the fact that you were recently permanently suspended from Twitter, where censorship has gone off the scale. I mean, it's just become a McCarthyite environment where any Indigenous voices or voices pushing back against the imperialist axis or against the aligned media and humanitarian agencies is just being shut down summarily. Can you walk us through what happened and the context?
Yes. During the war on Gaza 2 months ago, I was obviously tweeting about what is happening on the ground there. And a person who also works in the broadcasting industry, his name is Mark Goldberg. This is in Canada. He hosts annual conference for the industry where the Canadian Radio and Television Commission members come and mingle with all these industry people. So this person, Mark Goldberg, was really pissed off at my tweets criticizing apartheid Israel and showing its crimes. So he decided to start harassing me and tweeting at me. He's done that already prior to that, but never, as vulgar as he did this time. And what he did is he tweeted out saying that I am receiving funding from the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, the CRTC, and linked to the funding grants that I received specifically for the consulting on the rights of disability communities who happen to be Indigenous or from racialized communities within the broadcasting sector. The CRTC was doing a hearing about implementing the new Canadian Accessible Canada Act that enforces protections for these communities. And so he basically was kind of asking people basically to harass me in my employment space and somehow get me defunded. I'm safe, I believe. I don't think he can achieve that. But what it did is that it meant that I received a lot of hate emails at my work. And so I responded to Mark Goldberg saying, well, although I believe he's a racist as a Zionist, he's still hosting those conferences that the CRTC is coming to, and there's nothing I can do about it. So, and engaged him a couple of times on responding. And it was clear from the responses back to him that the audience was not liking his posts, but were liking my posts and sharing them when I respond to it. So it seems like he got really pissed somehow and complained to Twitter. And it took 2 months for Twitter to make a decision, I guess, on this complaint. And they decided that me responding to his harassment and his threats to my income and my livelihood is in itself a threat and a call for violence. And so it's illogical, but it seems Twitter has adopted the basic Zionist propaganda that anytime anybody brings up Palestine, that in itself is threatening to the safety of Jewish people in the West. And of course, it's crazy talk. There's no relation between Judaism and Zionism, a political ideology. And the criticism of apartheid Israel is not leading to more hate to Jewish people. On the contrary, you're seeing more and more Jewish people that are coming out critical of apartheid Israel because of the work of educating the masses in general in the West on Palestine.
But I mean, this is also an example of the disproportionate force of the Zionist ideology, right? I mean, it's a microcosm of what we see in Palestine, both in Gaza and in the occupied territories. We see the Zionist settler state terrorist policy, which is to oppress the Palestinians, to suppress their voices, to imprison them, to detain them, to torture them. And it's exactly the same reaction from any Zionist in the West to criticism or to a challenge of their policies. It becomes this disproportionate lobbying because they have such a powerful entity behind them, right? Whether it's in industry, whether it's in the military industrial, it doesn't matter what sector of industry or society, they have a huge amount of power behind them. And they will turn that power against their challenger, against someone who is calling them out. And this is indicative of Zionist ideology, right? And so therefore, Twitter is effectively playing along with that. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, Twitter and Facebook are their instruments. They are their weapons. So we shouldn't really be surprised when Twitter behaves as it is dictated to behave against those that are challenging, whether it's Zionism or whether it's imperialism, whether it's any form of establishment oppression, right? But what I'm worried about, and even in some ways worried about for you. Is there any actual protection for voices like yours that expose the Zionist terrorism that clearly extends way beyond the borders of the Palestinian land they are illegally occupying? You should be protected by your employer, for example, but we know there are cases of those that have challenged the Zionist entity in all of its forms, and they have been heavily penalized for it. You coming from, let's say, in some ways, a legal background, what protections are there for the voices that are speaking out? I mean, I'll give another example, Kevork Almasyan, a Syrian in Germany who has come under huge sustained fire from both extremist Syrian communities that have been given asylum in Germany, but also from his host government, for example, who, of course, is aligning itself with Zionist US coalition policy inside Syria. So I'd like to kind of get a feel from you as to what in the future can protect these voices, what can encourage them to express themselves more freely.
Look, it took me 25 years to receive my Canadian citizenship. I don't know if it's the longest time any person took to receive the citizenship in Canada, but most of the lawyers that worked with me were boggled at how long it took and how many delays were enforced politically through interference by politicians to stop immigration. So to go back to Twitter and to silencing in general of critical voices, it used to be before social media that when the mass media starts slandering somebody, you have the ability to sue them, and if they actually libel and slander and call you names. And I've been many times on national television in Canada, on all the major networks over the last 20 years of my activism. Nobody ever dared call me anti-Semitic on live television. Nobody ever dared call me threatening or hateful or that I promote violence. None of those, because if they would have done that on air, I would have taken them to court and I would have won, because they would have to prove those accusations. The problem with Twitter right now is that it has given itself the powers that are usually held by a court. These are, the accusations of hateful conduct or promotion of violence or threatening or attacking people based on race, ethnicity, national origin, what they quote in the ruling of why they blocked me from Twitter. These are actually legal accusations that are, people are usually held accountable to them. They're part of the criminal code of Canada and the United States. So by Twitter deciding to make rulings with such statements, it has appointed itself as a court. It has appointed itself as judge, jury, and executioner. It has usurped the rights of individuals to the basics of natural justice or common law, the right to know your accusers, the right to cross-examine your accuser, the right to present evidence and see the evidence against you prior to a judgment being made. So all of those are flagrant breaches of the basics of justice, natural justice, and common law. And if somebody would have done that to me, that is not Twitter, and it was done to me, let's say, by Concordia University, expelled by an order, a decree from the president of the university, without having an internal hearing or and I went to court for that, and 9 months later won the court, where the judge said, even though that the Concordia University was claiming to be a private institution, that even if it wants to make rulings, it has to create an internal hearing panel that abides by the norms of natural justice. And here, Twitter is not even creating this fake, internal tribunal that they can come in front of a court, that they have followed some of the norms of natural justice. And so stopping me or others from taking Twitter to is the exuberant cost that will happen. So it will cost, Twitter will probably pile up hundreds, tens of lawyers in the court, and then you drag it on for years. And so anybody who wants to take Twitter to assert their basic rights will need a big budget with them. So we're looking right now to see what President Trump will do. And if he actually sues them and gets back on Twitter, he may get us all our rights, this Mr. Trump that a lot of people complain about.
That would be quite ironic if Trump brings back our freedom of speech. So we spoke just quickly before we started the interview, and I believe you've heard from Twitter that they're not intending to reverse the decision following your appeal. And I guess that means, we're way down the path of bias and censorship of voices that rock the establishment or the imperialist boat, let's say. In the future, how do you perceive that these wars, that the resistance pushback against the imperialist access are going to be reported? Because clearly, and we saw this, of course, during the latest Zionist aggression against Gaza and the resistance reaction, that voices were literally being removed from social media if they were showing any bias whatsoever towards the Palestinian cause. They were literally just getting deleted from whether it was Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, etc. So we're clearly in an era of total loss of freedom of speech. We're living in a global totalitarian tyranny as regards any challenge of imperialist narratives and so on. What are the alternatives in your view, and are they already being worked on? Are they already being considered and planned for?
In my opinion, there will be no alternatives. Although, a lot of people are looking for other platforms, or including myself, who I'm using VK now, and created my own blog with my name, laithmarouf.com. But the truth is, the future looks very bleak. On the one hand, we see that these social media platforms are becoming nationalized in terms of where people are. So if I'm on Twitter or on Facebook, my main reason to be there is to speak to the Western audience who are all there. So if I'm not allowed to be there and I'm pushed to go to VK, where it's mainly Russian and Eastern, audience, that means I lost the utility. I don't, most of the people in Russia and or the East already are supportive of Palestinian rights, already know the basics, and I'm really speaking mostly to the converted. And so therefore, what's the point of me propagating these ideas on VK? So the future that I see is that the internet will become intranets. So we already saw how China and Russia and other countries have talking about or put already on the junctures of the internet cables, walls to control the West trying to affect the population's opinions of China and Russia. And that's the future that's going to happen everywhere. The same thing for social media. There will be social media platforms that are used in China or in Russia or in the Arabic world or in Latin America, but are not used or accessible in the United States or the West. So the future is more fragmentation and less freedom of speech. The owners of these media platforms like Twitter and Facebook actually made the decision to, burn all the utility of their social media platform during that last war on Palestine. We saw them throwing out tens of thousands of accounts and or banning even the hashtag Palestine in every language, the hashtag Jerusalem in every language, which means that it was out in the open. Everybody knew that they're mass censoring, and they didn't care. They didn't care. They don't care if we all leave. For them, they will do everything to protect imperialism and apartheid Israel.
This brings me to my final point, which we've spoken about before, but you've just described an environment in which people in the West, audiences in the West, are going to receive their information on specific subjects, like, for example, Palestine, like Syria, like Iraq, etc., from a very limited supply of YouTube pundits, those that have not been fully censored for over-challenging the establishment narratives, for example, right? I mean, that's basically what we're talking about here. And we've seen an example fairly recently of this, where various independent, supposedly anti-imperialist media outlets have been sustaining, but not just sustaining, they've actually almost been pushing the original CIA MI6 narratives that enabled the war against Syria in 2011. We have narratives like, for example, the brutal dictator, the political prisoners, the authoritarian regime. President Assad has done disgusting things against his own people, etc., etc. Right, and this is coming from media outlets that purport to be anti-imperialist, that purport to understand the extent of the US coalition, and that includes UK, France, the whole of the EU, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, etc., intervention, both military and economic, against the Syrian people. And yet, they don't appear to have any problem in regurgitating these narratives without providing substantiation or evidence, because of course we know that the evidence is going to come from the likes of New York Times, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, corrupted UN agencies that have effectively sustained the war against Syria, etc. And so the worry is, for me particularly, is it appears that they are reducing down the reporting from those that are either on the ground or those who come from the ground, those who are indigenous to the target country and who understand the history and the context better than anyone else, and yet who are denied effectively a platform. As you said, we don't now have you on Twitter, and for me, you were a go-to voice to check on let's say the grassroots Palestinian Syrian view on what was happening, and it was an invaluable resource for me and for many others. And yet we are seeing those disappearing, leaving us with what I can only describe as a kind of gatekeeping echo chamber environment, where it's going to be very hard for people to seek out alternative narratives. What's your view on that?
Look, many of the things that you brought up are real. You know, we see this been happening for decades, where it's problematic more so than ever with these issues in Palestine and the Arabic world, is the fact that there's very little Arab voices that are allowed to be speaking. And most of those who are speaking are white, sometimes mostly also Jewish white. And so here is people from the oppressor group being not only dominating the right wing and the imperialist media platforms, but are also dominating the little space that is there to be progressive, to be anti-imperialist on these, supposed independent media outlets. It really bothers me when people talk about prisons and in Syria, or say police state in Syria, and especially when they're sitting in the United States or they're American citizens, where the United States has the largest prison population in the world and the highest per capita incarceration rate. That's, we're talking close to 4 million people in the United States are in jail, and the incarceration rate is like close to 700 people per 100,000. And this is the highest incarceration rate and biggest prison population in the history of humanity. 25% of people in jails on this planet are in the United States, which is 5% of the population of the world. Yeah. And so you look at the history of just the last 30, 40 years in the United States, and you can see that every African diaspora, every indigenous, every Latino leaders of liberation in the United States were killed, assassinated in public, were jailed, were exiled, some of them still rotting in the jails right now, the Black Panthers and others, hundreds of them rotting in the jails of the United States. And torture. How can you, after Guantanamo Bay, after Abu Ghraib, after the black sites of disappearance sites that the United States ran over the last decade, how can you even accuse anybody of anything like that? And here, when we're talking about Syria, prior to the 2011 war on Syria, there was only 10,599 prisoners in Syria, and all the prisons of Syria. So one is 4 million, the other is 10,000. The prison population rate was 60 to 100,000, as opposed to almost 700 in the United States, to 100,000. When you say a police state, and the New York Police Department alone is considered the 4th biggest army in the world, militarily. It's unbelievable to, it reminds me when people say these things about Syria or Cuba, for instance, say, oh, police state, dictatorship, or so forth. It reminds me of the Zionists claiming everything is anti-Semitic. It loses the meaning of the word. If you have such a flagrant police state dictatorship as the United States, that is with such high numbers, and you want to compare Syria to it and then call Syria a police state, it means this word doesn't have a meaning. And so most people that are speaking in such ways, and we call them left or progressive, they're doing it to maintain some credibility in front of this imaginary Western audience that they're pitching their stories to. And this is where it's very dangerous, because it means that those individuals are not prioritizing truth. They're prioritizing their careers. I can't believe somebody would, on the one hand, some of these reporters that we saw talk about the oligarchy and the lack of democracy in the United States. And we saw what happened to Corbyn or Sanders, and there's a lot of criticism to those two individuals. But we saw how democracy doesn't really exist in the United States. And then turn around and call Syria a dictatorship, a country that has been under CIA war since 1942, since before the CIA was created.
Yeah, exactly. Or to call out undemocratic elections in Syria when, you know, American elections are really nothing more than pure theater, right? Or talk about, of course, when we talk about torture, let's also remember that the US has trained the UAE camp, what do you call them, guards in the south of Yemen that are torturing Yemenis, you know? I mean, both Israel and the US have exported torture and police brutality globally, you know, and yet you have pundits from that country calling out Syria. And it's also worth pointing out for people that prior to 2011, Amnesty International, Anwar Bunni, who was an opposition legal figure, a very prominent figure, both Amnesty International and Bunni stated that there were only around 1,500 political prisoners in Syrian jails, and Assad released 800 of those. And when we talk about political prisoners, of course, this terminology is also misleading, because political prisoners refers mostly to prisoners that were taken in the late 70s and 80s during the CIA engineered Muslim Brotherhood uprising, which was put down by Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad. But of course, what is never mentioned is that these political prisoners carried out attacks on civilian targets, carried out sectarian massacres, exactly as they have done from 2011 onwards. So the lexicon is also very misleading. And the fact that this lexicon is being parroted by journalists who are not doing the background reading to either justify their conclusions, which I believe they would struggle to do if they did actually do some research, or to balance out and contextualize their conclusions, right? And this is what worries me, is that we're going to be left with these kind of shallow talking points that basically reinforce Western media manufacturing consent for another interventionist war, whether it is Syria, whether it is the next target nation, whether it's China, of course, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia. The list is still quite long. And I think if there's one message that I would like to put out to people, you are going to start losing the voices that are going to counterbalance these narratives. So it is very important not to take these utterances at face value. And I think, you know, Laith, you've really made it very clear that where these, the danger is that these talking points are coming from what should be safe ground for most people, right? But I think the warning is, don't trust anyone. Do your own research, do your own digging, make your own conclusions, right? I think that's the only thing we can now say, because my voice, your voice is quite possibly going to disappear at some point altogether, right?
Yeah. Look, if you, all these accusations that are being thrown at Syria by individuals who are supposedly criticizing imperialism, it's laughable, because at the same time you look at, they themselves admit that there is no democracy in the United States or the West, that there is genocides being committed by the imperialist forces, that even if you want to claim that war crimes are being committed by this or that small state, it is nothing in comparison to the war crimes of the United States. There is no freedom of speech in the United States. There is a police state that is wild, killing every day on average two African Americans. Their police forces, on average, in all major cities, is two African Americans shot dead by the police a day. And they are sitting in this inside the belly of the beast, inside the empire. They cannot achieve change in their states. That is the apex of the imperial order. They cannot achieve even electing somebody as bland as Sanders, okay? Or bring themselves health care, and they demand from nations that are attempting to decolonize, that have been in a war of decolonization since the end of World War II, who hasn't had one day of rest. They demand that those states like Syria or Cuba or North Korea to have the utopic achieved. Otherwise, they will not stand by them. And you're like, but you have all the freedoms, supposedly, and the comfort to achieve those supposed utopic rights of democracy and equality and so forth, and you can't achieve them. But you want us under a war since 1942, eight different coups before the Ba'ath came into power in the 1970s. Eight different coups that were caused by the CIA in Syria alone. And so it doesn't make sense. None of the things that they're saying make sense. And it just requires very simple thoughts, ideas that I just put forward to you to clearly show that it doesn't make sense what they're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Laith, thank you so much. Where can people find your work? You mentioned your blog.
Yes, so I have my blog. I just started it. It's laithmarouf.com, all one word, and I'm on VK, also under my name, Laith Marouf. I hopefully will start writing more articles to be published in outlets like Mint Press and Al Mayadeen Television on their new English website. We'll see.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, maybe now that I have more time, because I'm not on Twitter, I'll write full articles.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because your voice is very valuable, and we shouldn't lose it. And if you need any other platforms, just let me know. Just reach out, because there's plenty that would be perfectly happy to, or more than happy, sorry, to publish your work, like The Last American Vagabond, Off Guardian, Unlimited Hangout, etc. I'm sure they would all pick up your work and publish.
That's great. Thank you very much. I will outreach to you as soon as I start publishing.
All right. Thanks ever so much, Laith.
All right. Have a nice day.